Steve, can you talk about the wildfires in Arizona and how the dual crises of the fires and the COVID have exposed, the deadliness of climate change?
Yeah, well, I think that so first of all, I'll talk about the fires. So the fires are of historic size. Three of the top 10 biggest fires were burning in the month of June in Arizona in state history. They were I forgot all this. I'll name some of the cities that they were the equivalent size or bigger. Like if you put them all combined, like it was bigger than Portland, bigger than Miami, bigger than Chicago, bigger than Manhattan, bigger than there's probably like 5 or 6 major U.S. metropolitan cities. The size of these fires was bigger than all of those combined, which I put in my article in the
They're
Guardian.
still burning right now. Is that correct?
They are mostly there are still some that are burning. The ones that I'm talking about that are the three biggest historic ones are mostly contained, I would say, like 80+% contained or more. The biggest one is 100% contained, the bushfire, which was northeast of Phoenix. But yeah, it just these got a little bit lost in the radar because June was such a crazy month, and I think that it was symbolic that one of them was actually burning within view. There was a video that a local news report put out that it was burning within view of where Trump was speaking when he was speaking in Phoenix at that church. And
Oh, I wish it was right behind him. That would
it
have
kind
made
of
it
was.
look
It
so
wasn't right.
big.
It was. Yeah, he was in the church, but if you were outside of the church in line, you could actually see like within distance, not like right next to it, but you could see the fire burning. One of the smaller ones that was burning in the Phoenix area. But yes, that was like 1,000 acres. So definitely not a tiny fire, but that shows the scope of this. The ones that are like there's several 1,000 acre fires. Those ones are considered like minor because there's a lot of these fires. The three biggest fires, those are all 100 plus 1,000 acres in size. We're talking about over 350,000 acres were the three biggest. So yeah, so that's the size of them to go to the
That's
COVID
insane.
thing. It is insane. Yeah, and I think that the COVID thing, it's kind of frustrating because we still don't know like if we know that the smoke from fires and the particulate matter can lodge into your lungs, and that can make you more susceptible to contract the virus, and can make the not only that, it can make the virus the level of the morbidity or the ability to die from it much higher. We know that that kind of smoke can have that effect. We don't know how much that is impacting what's happening right now in Arizona, which is this huge uptick in the coronavirus. There's 25, I think the last time I saw 25% of those tested are testing positive for the virus, is the highest in the country. And this
Wow.
is their whole spike in coronavirus is happening at the same time as these fires. But of course, it's not only the fires, but that said, I think it's probably fair to say it can and probably is having some kind of compounding effect just because of the science. Of course, the state's own policy and how they handled it even before the fire started with their governor and opening stuff up and having almost no limitations on how the stuff was opened up is an even bigger contributing factor probably overall. But I think that it doesn't help that you have this smoke in the air. And just to put it in perspective,
I have never been more grateful to live in New York than I am right this moment
yeah,
in
no,
my
there's
life.
an interesting bar chart that shows the Arizona one going way up, and you see the New York one going down. So that just shows a difference in how it was handled, first of all, but also yeah, it helps that there aren't huge fires that happen with the smoke. And just to, like, I'll just put the smoke in
Although
perspective.
we do have a lot of, the marginalized communities here in New York have a lot of air pollution because of the
Absolutely.
city and the way it was laid out.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's not to downplay. Yeah, definitely. And that's a even and I'll talk about that for a second for another marginalized community in Arizona. So that's the Navajo Nation. But real quick, so the smoke actually can travel 60 miles, is what was seen from one of the fires. So it's like even if you don't live right next to where the fires take place, the smoke can still be impacting your community within a 60-mile radius. That was taken from a NASA satellite. You can see the smoke traveling 60 miles from the epicenter of the wildfires. So that just shows like how big of a range. If you have three of these huge mega fires going on at the same time within the state, and they all have these 60-mile smoke radiuses around them on so that's yeah, it's a significant moment. I think that I'll be interested to see what kind of science comes out of it. Is how much did this smoke and the aftermath of the fires impact the spread of the virus? But I think that getting the marginalized community, because that's a really important point. And two of these fires happen on native reservations within Arizona. One of them was, of course, the one that's the highest per capita COVID epicenter in the United States right now, which is the Navajo Nation. And that was not one of the three biggest ones, but it wasn't small. It got up to 12,000 acres. And there's a good article in the Guardian that came out. Mine mentioned it, but there's an article that came out after in the Guardian that really goes into how did these fires impact the Navajo Nation community that lived around this fire. So it's definitely worth checking out. But yeah, they're definitely both of these tribes. The other one is the San Carlos Apache Nation. Both of these places are having issues with the coronavirus disproportionately compared to other parts in the state. So that just shows like how these compounding impacts can impact these different communities. Like you mentioned New York, and of course it can be almost anywhere. Like the New York Times earlier this week, their story was kind of the most comprehensive one so far. I think they said that they concluded, looking at the data, that if you're Latino, you're 3 times more likely to I don't know if it was either die or to contract the virus, and then if you're Black, it's like 2.5 times more likely. So I'm sure if Native American is right in line with that as well. So that just shows that this virus is having very disproportionate impacts on our marginalized communities in the United States.
Can you talk a little bit about what parts of climate change are contributing to these fires?
I'm glad you asked.
I'm sure this is not going to be the first and only fire. If this one got ignored, there's bound to be another. We're right at the beginning of fire season for the Southwest.
Yeah, well, so Arizona has some, although decreasing amount but still a legacy of coal extraction, right? So there's that part of it, and lots of mining in different parts of the state. So not necessarily for fossil fuels, but still the mining sector causes greenhouse gas pollution of its own and other kinds of so there's obviously other kinds of pollution too, but the one that contributes to climate change would be the greenhouse gases. So there's that. And then I think that this puts like a fine point on it. Like I didn't mention it yet, but only one house burned down. And why is that relevant to this question? Well, I think that a lot of people would say Arizona is very similar to California in the way that it has a sprawl style of housing development. That is, unlike like New York City, for example, or some of the big cities in China, like where there's high rise housing, you have to, there's so many people contained in a smaller space. Unlike that, like they have a sprawl style. So there's this housing that spills out into what's called the wildland urban interface, as land use scholars call it. So there's housing that gets closer and closer to nature, natural environments, and that means that people are driving. It's not close to public transit or anything, so people are driving a lot more in places like California or Arizona, and so that's a huge contributor to is sprawl style housing, and that's becoming a bigger and bigger issue in places like the Phoenix metropolitan area, and elsewhere. And I would say that if you look at the greenhouse gases generated from vehicles, I haven't looked at the percentage in Arizona. In California, 41% of the emissions come from cars on the road. So it's not, we do have a big oil industry here, but the biggest contributor is cars on the road still from this. And I think that most people would say it's from this sprawl style landscape that we have. And that's why in California, it's even more severe. So that's why, like in Paradise, California in 2018, this town that was basically created in what became an entire wildland urban interface town, it basically burned down in 2018, where there's very little left of the town because of the fires were so severe and there was so much housing within high risk fire zones. So I would say that
we like to build housing in the bogs, right up against the floodplain. We just fill it in with rocks. What could happen?
How can't end badly, right? Yeah. So I think that from that perspective, Arizona had a little bit of a lucky break from that perspective, is that it didn't really affect housing. That speaks a lot to the effort that the firefighters and
not human housing, animal housing for sure.
No, yeah, and that is huge. Like and also the biological landscape. There's a very like an endangered cactus in Arizona that there's a new article that came out, and people were talking about it before, but those got hit hard. It's called the saguaro cactus. So I think it still remains to be seen how bad this was from, as you mentioned, animal life, and also from plant and other kind of species. So yeah, that analysis is actually being done right now by the because these three biggest fires all happen in national forests. So the National Forest Service is currently analyzing that, and those reports should be out in the next couple of weeks. So,
okay, now that scares me because I'm just about to move to the forest myself.
oh man,
Oh, this is not good. I thought it was safer, but apparently not.
Depends on where you live.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it'll rain. Yeah, somewhere, Um, oh, goodness gracious.
Yeah, well, actually, speaking of rain, I'll say that. Yeah, that's that. What's the number? You asked about contributors. So, like, well, what's the impact, right? Arizona, it doesn't has like it's supposed to be the monsoon season, but it has rained very little, and therefore it's been just super hot there. It's been like 105 to 115 degrees daily since June, and windy. Those conditions plus wind equals prime fire conditions, and that's why we're seeing these historic fires in Arizona.
Do they know what's starting the fires?
Yeah, that's another good question. So the fires have been started by a combination of sometimes it's like like the biggest one was like started by like a chain on the car. It kind of sparked, and that's all it took to start a fire that ended up being it spread to be like 180,000 acres. So it's like it shows us how dry the tinder is and like how little of a spark can make these fires spread in the way that they do. And then the other crazy thing is two of the one in Navajo and then one of the other big ones. It was started by and I think at least one other were started by lightning. So it's like a lightning strike hit and that sparked the fire. So it just shows how dry the tinder is in the West, and it could just be like a lightning strike, or it could be someone tossing out a cigarette. That's happened in California before. The landscape is so dry and the conditions are so prime for these fires that's all it takes to start these historic, monumental fires in the age of the climate crisis in the West.